Live now look there at and outside the Supreme Court on this Friday night there in Washington. Major news there at the Supreme Court. I want to put up this tweet from our friend, Fox News Sunday anchor Shannon Bream. She says this, breaking. SCOTUS denies special counsel Jack Smith's request to expedite the decision on President Trump's immunity claim. That means it will continue on its normal course through the appellate court and makes that March trial start date less likely for Smith and the DOJ. In the meantime, this is a major headline on this Friday going into Christmas week. We want to talk about it even further with our friend, legal analyst Seth Berenzweig. He joins me now. Seth, good to see you. Thanks for being with us here on this Friday night here. I guess my first question to you is essentially, this just now goes through the normal appellate process. It's not getting expedited here. Is this a win for Trump and a loss for Smith? Is that how people are interpreting this today?
Yes, it's a win, but it's not a game changer. So this was a request by the special prosecutor, the special counsel, to expedite. Basically, he was asking for permission to cut in line, and it would have saved him a couple of weeks. And the Supreme Court, in a nondescript, brief order, denied that and told Jack Smith he's just going to have to get back in line. In the short term, is this a win for Mr. Trump? Absolutely. But the reason it's not a game changer is because, as a matter of process, the D.C. Court of Appeals has greatly expedited the case, and the hearing's going to happen on January 9th. And then the decision will probably be out a few days after that. So it will happen really in just a couple of weeks. And then it might, of course, end up back in the Supreme Court. So it's not going to be a big game changer from a timing standpoint in that regard. And as a matter of substance, this appellate court already ruled on the immunity issue in the case involving the Capitol Police, where former President Trump said that he had presidential immunity. And that court, in a very closely related case, said that since at that moment on January 6th, the president was acting in a political capacity and not an official capacity, presidential immunity does not apply. Now, that's not an exact mirror image match, but it's pretty darn close. So yes, it's a win and it's an important news item, but it's not a huge game changer.
You're right, Seth, because the arguments there at the appellate level had already been scheduled for January 9th, and so those will proceed as follows here. And I thought this was interesting, and this is somewhat customary, that when the Supreme Court does something like this on an emergency basis, they don't normally sign the opinion or the ruling here. Isn't that right? They just kind of give their decision unsigned. Should we have expected a signature from any of the justices? Because there was no, dissents in this.
No, it's not surprising.
Okay.
It's kind of not a very exciting or sexy kind of styled order. It's really what some might even call a minute order. It's just a line that is entered by the court electronically. In this kind of an instance, it's really standard operating procedure that no judge would sign off on it officially, but it is an official court order. It has been denied, and therefore it does go back to the D.C. Court of Appeals. It is certainly a short-term win for the former president, but the issues will be twofold in front of the D.C. Court of Appeals. We had just noted the immunity issue, and frankly, I think the former president, is going to have an uphill battle on that, as we've mentioned a moment ago. He's also trying to argue that he's subject to double jeopardy, and since he was tried in the Senate, he should be similarly immune because of the double jeopardy clause. I also think that that's going to be a real tough one for Mr. Trump to win, because double jeopardy really applies to criminal proceedings. The Senate chamber isn't even a court. So don't be shocked if the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals rules in favor of Jack Smith, and then perhaps the Supreme Court doesn't accept review. It is a discretionary review, which means that the trial, in any event, may still start on time. So there will be a lot of developments coming, and we'll see.
That's quite the prediction there. So you're saying you don't think it's even going to get to the Supreme Court after the appellate process there?
Well, I would say with a very slight adjustment that I think it's quite possible and would not be surprising to me if the Supreme Court does not accept the case. And I say that for a few reasons. I don't believe that the D.C. Circuit Court when it rules, is going to be ruling in a manner that's contrary to law or that distinguishes a conflict in the circus, which is traditionally a reason why the Supreme Court accepts these kinds of cases. I also believe that this is something that we shouldn't be very surprised about, because the Supreme Court will want to find a way to delicately avoid getting directly involved in the presidential election. Remember that Colorado, just the middle of this week, had a landmark decision which struck Mr. Trump from the ballot based upon the disqualification clause under the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court already has its hands full.
Yeah,
I really don't know how excited it's going to be to take this case too.
Yeah.
So it's not an outright prediction, but I think that it is quite probable. And even if the Supreme Court takes it, they could expedite and we could still end up with a trial that either ends up on time or just slightly delayed.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And let's just kind of walk back briefly, if we can. This is about the federal election subversion case Jack Smith brought there in the D.C. jurisdiction, regarding former President Trump, then President Trump's actions, statements during and after January 6th, the moment of the Capitol riot leading into that. And he's charged with conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. Those are one of the four charges here. And the immunity question now is in play because that is kind of the legal tactic the Trump legal team is deploying here. In very layman's terms, to make it as generic as possible, Seth, give us kind of a simple definition of what that legal argument is.
Sure. So there has always historically been, to a degree, a respect for some aspect of presidential immunity. And there has certainly been instances in the history of the Supreme Court where presidential immunity has applied. And in this instance, the former president, Mr. Trump, is saying that as a result of that, and since he was trying to allegedly ensure truthful and accurate results, he should similarly be immune from criminal prosecution. The problem with that theory, aside from the fact that in a very closely related case, this very court, the DC Court of Appeals, has already rejected that argument, is that historically the Supreme Court has looked at this and has already made it clear that presidential immunity is not unlimited. See, for example, United States versus Nixon in the 70s, where the Supreme Court said that in matters pertaining to criminal investigations and the like, that presidential immunity has a limitation. So that's the principle in the history. And also the history related to the double jeopardy argument relates to a constitutional principle that would have a similar application. But again, it really is very much up in the air and would be a significant uphill battle as to whether that would be a successful argument in the DC Court of Appeals.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that the Supreme Court really has its work cut out for them going into 2024 about many of these questions that it rarely gets presented about, presidential immunity. To your point, the Trump legal team has appealed the Colorado Supreme Court ruling from earlier in the week that disqualified him from the primary ballot there, and so many other really Trump-related cases and stories here. So a decision by the Supreme Court could determine his legal and political fate. That's kind of what everyone is, or at least how they're interpreting it as well. Seth Berenzweig, as always, thanks so much for your legal insight into this major story today, and we'll talk soon.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.